Hello everyone, and welcome back to my channel. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, so before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying this video. Story 1. The Lights in the Fog. It was supposed to be just another weekend camping trip. Something fun, a break from the usual grind of college life. Ben, Mia, Greg, and Sarah had been planning it for weeks, each of them hoping for a quiet retreat in the woods, far from the constant noise of campus life. They had everything packed, the tents were set up, and the fire was crackling as they settled in for the night, ready to make memories they would laugh about for years to come. But it was the fog that rolled in after sunset that set the whole trip on a different path. The fog had come out of nowhere. One moment, the air had been crisp and clear, the stars visible through the canopy of trees above them. But the next, a damp mist began to creep across the ground, thick and suffocating, obscuring everything in its path. Ben, who had been telling jokes around the fire, stopped mid-sentence as the mist swallowed the trees just beyond the fire's light. The night had suddenly become eerily quiet, as if the forest itself had stopped breathing. "That's strange," Mia murmured, looking around at the dense fog that had formed so quickly. "I didn't hear any wind or anything. It's probably just a cold front moving through," Greg said, trying to sound calm, though there was a note of unease in his voice. It happened sometimes. The firelight flickered, casting strange shadows that danced around them. As they sat in silence, waiting for the fog to pass, something strange happened. In the distance, just beyond the reach of the fire's glow, tiny pinpricks of light appeared, faint, flickering orbs that seemed to hover in midair. "Do you see that?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Probably other campers," Ben suggested, squinting into the dark. "Maybe their fire's out there." But the lights didn't seem to belong to any campfire. They moved, slowly at first, then faster, as if they were being carried by someone or something. The lights shifted and bobbed through the fog, weaving between the trees, growing brighter as they neared. "Let's go check it out," Mia said, her voice curious, though she seemed uncertain. "Maybe it's someone who needs help." They all hesitated for a moment, the eerie atmosphere thickening around them. But then the pull of mystery was too strong to resist. "All right," Ben said, standing up, his flashlight flicking on. "Let's do it." They grabbed their flashlights and headed off into the fog, the sound of their footsteps muffled by the heavy mist. The lights continued to bob and flicker ahead of them, leading them deeper into the woods. The path was unclear, the trees and bushes surrounding them, shrouded in a pale, ghostly light. At first, it seemed like any other camping trip, until they realized that the lights weren't coming from anyone's campfire. They weren't floating aimlessly in the air either. They were moving with purpose, almost like they were trying to guide them somewhere. Ben quickened his pace, the others following. "Who do you think's out here?" he asked, trying to make light of the situation. But his voice sounded hollow in the thick air. "I don't know, but I've got a bad feeling about this," Greg admitted, his usual bravado fading away. As they pushed further into the forest, the air grew heavier, thicker with fog, until it felt like it was pressing against their lungs. It was difficult to breathe. like they were walking through a wall of wet cotton. But still, the lights kept moving ahead, always just out of reach, urging them forward. Then, after what seemed like hours of walking, they stumbled into a clearing. At first, they didn't see anything, but as their flashlights swept across the fog, they saw them, figures, tall, thin, and pale, standing in a perfect circle at the center of the clearing. There were at least a dozen of them, maybe more, each one holding a light. No, it wasn't a light at all. It was like a flame that burned without heat, flickering without a source. The figures didn't move, but the lights danced and twisted in midair, casting strange, shifting shadows that seemed to stretch and curl unnaturally. They're not real, Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. Ben tried to call out, but his voice seemed to catch in his throat, strangled by the oppressive silence that hung in the air. The figures, or whatever they were, didn't respond. They didn't even look at the group. Their heads were tilted downward, their bodies unnaturally still. Then, one of the figures began to sway, slowly at first, like it was testing its own movement. Then, the others followed suit. A faint humming began, barely audible at first, but it grew louder until it was a chant, soft, guttural, and rhythmic. The chant seemed to rise from the earth itself, a sound like 100 whispers overlapping, and as it grew louder, the ground beneath their feet seemed to shift. Mia grabbed Ben's arm. "We need to go. Now." But the lights were already shifting, moving in their direction, getting closer. The chant was getting louder, more insistent, and then it stopped. Dead silence. The fog thickened, swirling around them, cutting off the world beyond. The lights blinked out one by one, leaving only darkness. "Run!" Ben shouted, breaking the spell that had frozen them in place. They turned and ran, not looking back, the sound of their footsteps blending with the thudding of their hearts. The fog seemed to close in on them, suffocating, and the world outside the clearing had disappeared entirely. The trees were no longer trees. They were dark, twisted silhouettes in the dense fog. But the lights were still there. They followed them, just out of sight, always just behind, casting strange shadows that twisted in the fog like living things. No matter how fast they ran, the lights followed, growing nearer with each step. "Why is it following us?" Greg gasped, his voice wild. "What the hell is happening?" "I don't know," Ben shouted, his breath coming in short gasps. "We have to get back to camp. We need to." But before he could finish, the fog thickened, so dense now that they couldn't see their own hands in front of their faces. The lights blinked out again, and the woods fell into a suffocating silence. Not even the wind stirred. "Where are we?" Mia asked, panic creeping into her voice. "Ben, where are we? This isn't the way back." Ben tried to think, but everything was spinning. His mind was racing, but his body felt frozen, as if the fog itself was trying to keep him in place. His heart pounded in his chest, and the weight of the forest, the thick fog, and the ever-present sensation of being watched crushed him from all sides. And then suddenly the fog lifted. The world outside the trees was gone. The forest seemed to stretch on forever, but there was no sign of the road, the campsite, or the stars above them. It was as though the forest had folded in on itself, trapping them in a place where time didn't seem to exist. The lights were gone, but the figures remained, standing in their circle, their eyes now open, their gazes fixed on the group. And then, just as quickly as they had appeared, they vanished into the fog. The group stood there for a long time, trying to make sense of what they had just witnessed, but nothing made sense anymore. They never spoke of what happened that night, not to each other, and certainly not to anyone else. The fog had come for them, and it had taken them somewhere that none of them could explain. The lights in the fog were gone, but they would haunt them forever. And no matter how far they ran, they could still hear the faint hum of the chant, echoing in their minds, just as real as the fog that swallowed the world around them. Story 2. The Blackened Stump. It was the perfect weekend. The sun hung low in the sky, painting the world in shades of gold and amber. The air was still, crisp with the smell of pine, and the forest was alive with the chirps of birds and the rustling of leaves. The Williams family had been coming to these woods for years, escaping the busy grind of city life for weekends in the wilderness. There was something about this place, the remote, secluded spot deep in the heart of the forest, that always brought them peace. But this time, something was different. "Let's set up here," Sarah said, gesturing toward a clearing. She had been coming to these woods since she was a little girl, and the moment she stepped into the familiar stretch of trees, a sense of calm washed over her. It felt like home. Her husband, Mark, nodded. "Looks good. I'll get the tent set up." He grabbed the poles and stakes from the trunk of their car, while Sarah helped their two children, Lily and Ben, gather firewood. The kids were already excited, running around, their laughter filling the air. The clearing was perfect, nestled between towering trees with a quiet stream trickling nearby. A large, twisted tree stump sat in the center of the clearing, its gnarled roots stretching out like the fingers of some ancient hand. It was easily the size of a small car, and the jagged edges of its bark were charred black, as if struck by lightning long ago. The stump had always been there, a part of the landscape, but today, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that it looked different, almost like it had grown bigger since the last time they camped here. "Weird," she muttered, staring at the stump. It was as if something about it was breathing. Mark didn't seem to notice. "Just part of the forest charm," he said, tossing a bundle of firewood to the side. "The kids will love it here. Let's just get the tent up before it gets dark." That night, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the air grew colder, the stillness settling over the forest like a heavy blanket. The family sat around the campfire, eating dinner and telling stories. The fire crackled, sending sparks into the dark sky. But every so often, Sarah would glance over at the stump, the dark shape looming in the center of the clearing. It was hard to ignore. "Mom," Ben asked suddenly, his voice small, "why does that tree look like it's moving?" Sarah frowned, unsure of what he meant. She looked over at the stump. It was still, like all the other trees in the clearing, but there was something about it that made her uneasy. Something in the air was different. She shook off the feeling. "It's just the wind," she said. "Nothing to worry about." But the feeling wouldn't go away. The stump seemed to pulse, ever so slightly, in time with the beating of her own heart. As the night deepened, the shadows grew longer, stretching out like fingers across the clearing. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves in the trees, but it wasn't the usual calming breeze. This wind felt wrong. It carried a faint whisper, like voices just on the edge of hearing. Sarah shivered but didn't say anything. Lily and Ben had long since curled up in their sleeping bags, their faces turned toward the warmth of the fire. Sarah and Mark sat quietly by the campfire, their eyes flicking nervously to the stump every now and then. It was then that Sarah noticed something she hadn't before. The stump was darker. The charred edges seemed to have grown more pronounced, the wood so black it almost looked like it was burning. But there was no flame, no heat. The stump itself seemed to be swallowing the light, absorbing it into its very core. "Mark," she whispered, her voice low, "look at the stump." He glanced over and frowned. "What is it?" "It's just a tree, Sarah." But the longer he stared, the more uncomfortable he looked. The stump was no longer just a stump. It seemed to be moving slowly, imperceptibly, like something inside it was alive. The temperature dropped sharply, and a strange hum filled the air, vibrating in Sarah's chest. The stump, once still, now pulsed. In the flickering light of the fire, it looked almost as if it was breathing. "Mom," Lily whispered from the tent, her voice trembling. "I don't like it. The tree, it's watching us." Sarah's heart stopped. She had been trying to ignore the unease in her chest, but now it seemed undeniable. She stood up, the gravel crunching beneath her boots. "I'm going to check on the kids," she said, her voice shaky. Mark nodded but didn't take his eyes off the stump. Something was wrong, but he couldn't put his finger on it. It felt as though the entire forest was holding its breath. Sarah knelt beside the tent, unzipping it carefully. Lily and Ben were huddled together inside, wide-eyed. "Are you two okay?" she asked, trying to sound reassuring. Lily nodded, but Ben shook his head. "I don't like the noises, Mom. I hear things in the trees." Sarah's skin crawled. It wasn't the wind, not this time. She could feel it, the strange, humming sensation in the air, the weight of something ancient, something alive, something that shouldn't be. "It's just the wind," she said again, more firmly this time, though she wasn't sure she believed it. "You're safe. Just stay inside, okay?" As she turned to leave, she glanced back at the stump one last time, and that's when she saw it. The stump had cracked open, splitting down the middle like a rotten fruit. A dark, oily substance began to ooze from the jagged edges, pooling on the ground. It looked like sap, but it was black, darker than night, slick and glistening in the firelight. And it was forming shapes that shouldn't have been there. Figures, moving figures, emerging from the blackness of the stump. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest, and she stumbled backward. The forest was silent now. No rustling of leaves, no chirping of insects. Just that horrible, oppressive quiet. And then, in the distance, she heard something, a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The stump, or whatever was inside it, was waking up. Mark rushed to her side, his face pale. "What the hell is happening?" "I don't know," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. "But I think we need to leave." But as they moved toward the tent, they heard the sound of something moving in the woods. Not just the usual shuffle of animals, but something heavier, something larger. The ground beneath their feet began to tremble, faint at first, then stronger, until it was a violent shaking. It felt as though the earth itself was alive, as though it was waking up from a long slumber, ready to consume everything in its path. And then the stump split wider, wider still, until the very earth seemed to crack open. From the depths of the stump, something ancient and terrible rose. A figure, massive, twisted, and black, its limbs long and gnarled, its eyes glowing like embers. The rage of the forest had been awakened. Sarah grabbed Mark's arm, pulling him toward the tent, but the earth seemed to fight them. The ground was alive, shifting and buckling underfoot. The stump wasn't just a tree anymore. It was a gateway, a doorway to something far worse. "Run!" Mark screamed. They didn't look back as they fled, the forest closing in around them. The children were already out of the tent, running beside them, but they couldn't escape the feeling that something was chasing them, something that was once rooted in the earth and now was hungry. The last thing Sarah saw before the darkness swallowed them whole was the blackened stump, its open maw staring at them, as if to say, "You should never have come back." Story 3. The Unseen Watcher. Emma had always loved the mountains, the solitude, the air that felt cleaner than anything in the city, and the escape from the hustle of everyday life. It was exactly what she needed, a break from her job, from people, from everything. She'd planned this camping trip for weeks, alone in a secluded spot high in the mountains where few dared to venture. It was her time to reconnect with nature, to recharge, to think. By the time Emma reached the campsite, the sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows through the trees. She set up her tent, unpacked her gear, and built a small campfire to ward off the chill of the evening. The quiet of the mountains was almost deafening in its stillness. Not a bird sang, not a rustle of wind stirred the trees. It felt as if the world itself had gone to sleep. After a while, the fire crackled low, and the sky deepened into twilight. Emma curled up in her sleeping bag, her mind still buzzing from the drive up. She thought about how wonderful this would be. No distractions, no responsibilities, just the mountain air and the stars. She was lulled into a sense of peace, her thoughts drifting like the smoke from the campfire. That's when she heard it. At first, it was barely perceptible, a slight crunch of leaves, a disturbance in the silence. Emma sat up, her heart racing. It was close, too close for comfort. But when she looked out of her tent, all she saw were trees and the dimming light of dusk. She checked her gear, reassured herself that no animals had wandered too close, and went back to her sleeping bag. It was probably just an animal, she thought, maybe a deer or a raccoon. But the footsteps didn't stop. Each night, as the darkness deepened, Emma would hear them again. The unmistakable crunch of leaves, the unmistakable sound of something walking around her tent. The hairs on the back of her neck would prickle, but she told herself there was nothing. She was in the mountains, after all. There were animals. The sound could easily be the result of a curious deer, a fox, or even a bear. But it was always there, in the same place, at the same time, circling her camp like clockwork. By the third night, Emma was on edge. She hadn't slept well in days. The constant, creeping sound of the footsteps around her tent gnawed at her sanity, making her restless, making her second-guess every sound in the night. Every time she closed her eyes, she heard them, closer now, as if whatever it was watching her, waiting. Then, as dawn's first light broke through the trees, Emma stepped outside to gather firewood, hoping the fresh air would clear her head. She froze. There around her tent, in the soft earth, were footprints. Large, unmistakable prints, almost human in shape, but far too large. And they were circling her tent. Not one pair of prints, but many. Each set of prints seemed to follow the same path, winding around the perimeter of the tent in a perfect circle. Her stomach churned. This was no animal. No bear, no deer. These were deliberate, purposeful tracks. They weren't there the night before, and she knew it. She had checked. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, had been standing right outside her tent, watching her while she slept. As the day passed, Emma tried to convince herself that it was just some sort of bizarre coincidence. Maybe someone else had been up there hiking, but that didn't explain the tracks, or the way they circled her tent, as though something had been waiting for her to notice them. That night, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Her anxiety grew, gnawing at her insides, until she could hardly breathe. The footsteps came again, only this time they were closer. She heard the leaves crunch beneath heavy footsteps, pacing slowly outside her tent. They stopped for a moment, just long enough for Emma to hold her breath in terror, wondering what it was that was out there. She waited in silence, her heart pounding in her chest. Then the voice came. It was deep, guttural, like something from the very bowels of the earth. Emma! Her blood ran cold. It was as if the forest itself had spoken her name. Emma! The voice didn't sound like a person. It was far too low, far too raspy. It was the sound of something ancient, something wrong. Emma's instinct screamed at her to stay still, to not move, but every part of her body wanted to run. She gripped the edge of her sleeping bag, her knuckles white with fear, but she couldn't move. Her mind was paralyzed with dread. The footsteps resumed, this time in a slow, deliberate pattern. They moved around her tent, the sound growing louder, as if whatever it was had grown closer. Emma's pulse thundered in her ears. She knew there was no escape. Whatever it was, whatever had been circling her, watching her, waiting, it wasn't leaving. Suddenly, the air seemed to grow thick, pressing in on her from all sides. She couldn't breathe. Her vision blurred. Every sound felt amplified. Each crack of a twig, each rustle of a leaf, deafening in the silence. Emma squeezed her eyes shut, praying for it to end. She tried to block out the voice, the footsteps, the terror that seemed to consume her. But then, as if some unseen force lifted the weight from her chest, the footsteps stopped, and the silence that followed was worse than anything Emma had ever known. For hours, the world remained dead silent. No footsteps, no whispers, not a single sound. Emma didn't dare open her eyes. She clung to the fleeting hope that if she stayed perfectly still, if she stayed silent, it would all go away. By the time morning light finally broke through the trees, Emma felt as though she hadn't slept at all. She didn't wait for the sun to fully rise before she packed up her things. The tent went down in a blur, and she gathered her gear, trembling the entire time. She didn't stop to look around. She didn't stop to see if the prints were still there. She didn't need to. The dread in her gut told her everything she needed to know. She needed to leave. But as she slung her backpack over her shoulders and turned toward the trail, she heard it again. A voice, low, guttural, calling her name from the depths of the forest. Emma, it was too much. She didn't turn around. She didn't need to. The voice was already in her head, echoing in her bones. And it was getting closer. Story 4. The Wind That Screams. Jack had been hiking in the mountains for years. He was used to remote areas, far from the beaten path, where few people ventured. He'd heard the stories about the wind in these parts. Strange, unsettling tales whispered by the locals at the nearest town. They talked about a wind that howled through the trees at night, so loud it could be heard miles away, and it sounded like something more than just a gust of air. They called it the wind that screams, and the older folks said it wasn't natural. They said it carried voices of those who'd gotten too close to the forest, voices of people who'd vanished. Jack never believed them. That's what drew him here, to the heart of the wilderness. He loved a good challenge, and the idea that something as simple as wind could be terrifying didn't sit right with him. He planned to camp out in the very center of the forest, as far away from the townspeople's warnings as he could get. If anything, he thought he might be able to prove that the stories were just that, stories. The day he arrived was calm, the sun warm on his back, and the only sound was the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze. He set up camp near a small clearing and cooked himself a simple meal. The peace of the forest wrapped around him like a blanket, and for a moment, he forgot about the warnings. It was just him, the trees, and the faint sound of distant birdsong. He felt at home. As the sun dipped below the horizon and twilight settled in, the forest began to change. The air grew heavier, thicker, and the warmth of the day seemed to vanish. Jack tried to shake the growing unease that crept up his spine. The stories, he reminded himself, were nothing but superstitions. People had been telling tales for generations. He wasn't afraid. But then it started. At first, it was nothing more than the usual nighttime wind. A soft rustle of leaves, a gentle sigh of the trees swaying. But as the night deepened, it grew stronger. The wind seemed to pick up speed, gaining momentum, until it felt like something was pushing against him. Jack tightened his jacket, hoping the cold would pass, but it didn't. The gusts kept coming, growing louder and louder. Then he heard it, a faint scream, a long, drawn-out howl that came from nowhere. Jack froze, his breath caught in his chest. It wasn't the usual wind howling through the branches. It was a scream, a human scream. It wasn't just the wind. It was something else, something alive. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end as the sound echoed through the trees. So unnatural, so guttural, it didn't feel like it belonged to this world. He stood up, heart racing. Was someone else out here? Was someone in danger? But the forest around him was silent except for the wind. No footsteps. No voices, only that scream, now followed by another, louder and more desperate. The sound grew more intense, a high-pitched wail that made Jack's stomach twist. He wanted to run, to leave, but the wind kept him in place. He couldn't tear himself away, couldn't move, as if the forest itself had locked him in. The whisper started next. At first, it was barely audible, a breathy, distant murmur, like voices carried on the wind. Jack strained to hear, but the words were lost in the howling gusts. He shook his head. He was hearing things. He was alone in the middle of nowhere, and the stories were just that, stories. But the whispers didn't stop. They grew louder, more distinct, until they seemed to come from every direction. Jack's hands trembled as he looked around, but there was nothing. No one, just the forest and the wind. Jack, the wind whispered, a voice too clear, too human. His name, his pulse quickened. He'd heard it. That wasn't the wind, it was a voice. Someone knew his name. Someone was out there, calling him. He turned in every direction, but there was no one. Nothing. The wind had become a roar now, a constant, shrieking scream that rattled the trees and shook the ground. The whispers grew louder, sharper, as if they were coming from inside his head. "Jack, come closer," the voice crooned, smooth and seductive, like a lullaby. But it wasn't right. It wasn't friendly. There was something in it that made his blood run cold. Something wrong about the tone. The wind rose again, this time with a howl that nearly knocked him off his feet. The branches above him shook violently, and for a moment, Jack was sure the trees themselves were alive, reaching down to grab him. He stumbled back to his tent, desperately trying to block out the sound, but the whispers followed him. They were in his ears now, all around him, pressing in. His heart pounded in his chest as he shoved his belongings into his pack, but his hands were shaking too violently to work. The sound of his own breath felt foreign, as if it didn't belong to him anymore. The whispers began to form words. "We are here," the voice hissed, "and you can't leave." Jack's eyes widened in panic. He turned, scanning the trees, but nothing moved. The shadows were still. The wind screamed again, this time in a voice that was unmistakable. "Jack," it whispered once more, drawing the name out like a promise. The wind rose again, swirling around him like a living, breathing thing. His breath quickened, his chest tightening with fear. He grabbed his gear, his mind racing, his thoughts a blur of panic. He had to leave. He had to get out of here, back to the town, back to safety. But as he took a step forward, the wind shifted. It wasn't coming from the trees anymore. It was coming from the ground, from beneath his feet, swirling around him, rising from the earth itself. The ground beneath him seemed to vibrate, pulsing with an eerie energy, as if something was waking up. He turned, trying to find the path he had come from, but the forest had changed. The trees had closed in. The darkness seemed thicker, more oppressive. The wind howled like a beast hungry for flesh, and Jack realized with a sickening certainty that it wasn't just the wind. It was something else, something ancient. The whispering voices were now everywhere, coming from the trees, from the ground, from the air. "You can't hide," they murmured. "You can't escape." Jack's heart raced as he sprinted through the forest, the howling wind at his back, pushing him forward. His legs burned, his lungs screamed for air, but the voices kept calling, kept urging him to stop. He couldn't. He couldn't stop. He couldn't let them catch him. The trees seemed to bend toward him as he ran, their twisted limbs reaching for him, their leaves whispering his name. But Jack was too far gone. He couldn't hear them anymore. All he could hear was the wind, the terrible, screaming wind that followed him, always behind him, relentless. And then in the distance, he saw it, the edge of the forest. He was almost there. He was going to make it. But when he reached the edge, when he finally saw the town in the distance, he realized with a crushing sense of horror that the wind had stopped. And so had the whispers. The forest was silent, and Jack knew, deep in his bones, that the wind wasn't done with him. It had only been waiting for him to return. Story 5. The Hollow Tree. It was a Saturday morning when the group of 5 friends, Olivia, Mark, Sarah, Jake, and Emily, set out for their camping trip. They'd been planning it for months, searching for a place far away from the city's constant hum, a place where they could disconnect from the world and reconnect with each other. They found the perfect spot in the middle of a dense forest, miles from civilization, where the trees were tall and the air was thick with the scent of pine. The forest was known for being quiet, almost unnervingly so. The locals had warned them, told them that something about it was off. But the group dismissed it as superstition. They were used to the woods. Hiking, camping, and exploring were second nature to them. They weren't afraid of some old legends. But then they found the tree. It was Sarah who first noticed it, standing like a silent sentinel amidst the forest. A massive tree with an enormous trunk, gnarled and twisted. It had a hollow center, large enough for a person to crawl inside. The interior was black, like a shadow that refused to be touched by light, and the hollowed-out space seemed too perfect, too untouched by time. "Hey, check this out," Sarah called to the others, her voice tinged with curiosity and a bit of awe. The others gathered around, all of them staring at the tree. The dark cavity within beckoned them, as though it had been waiting. "Could make a pretty cool place to camp near," Mark said, his eyes glinting with excitement. It wasn't long before they set up camp nearby, their tents pitched just a few yards away. The forest was eerily silent, save for the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind, and the air was cool with the promise of nightfall. As the sun dipped below the horizon, an uneasy feeling began to settle over the group. They sat around the campfire, talking, laughing, and roasting marshmallows, but something about the tree remained unsettling. It loomed in the distance, its gnarled branches casting long shadows that stretched across the forest floor. "I swear, the tree looks like it's watching us," Olivia said, her voice quiet. She had been glancing toward the tree every few seconds, a frown knitting her brow. "It's just a tree," Jake said dismissively. He was always the skeptic, always ready to brush off anything that didn't fit within his neat, logical world. There's no such thing as a tree that watches. But even Jake's words couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. They decided to turn in for the night, retreating to their tents, but sleep didn't come easily. Every rustle of the wind, every creak of a branch seemed magnified in the silence. Olivia couldn't help but glance toward the hollow tree again, as if expecting to see something, someone standing there. Hours passed, and the quiet hum of the forest seemed to grow louder, more pronounced. Just as Olivia was about to drift off to sleep, she heard it, a soft scratching noise, faint but persistent. It came from the direction of the tree. At first, she told herself it was just a rodent, some animal seeking shelter in the hollow. But then the noise grew louder, more deliberate. It sounded like something was scraping against the inside of the tree. The scratching stopped for a moment, only to be replaced by a soft, rhythmic tapping. Olivia's heart raced. She wasn't sure what it was, but the sound made her blood run cold. Unable to ignore it any longer, she slipped out of her tent and crept toward the tree, her footsteps muffled by the damp earth. She reached the tree and stood in front of the hollow, staring into the darkness. The scratching had stopped, but the silence felt thick, like the air was holding its breath. She felt drawn to the tree, as if it were calling to her, and before she could stop herself, she leaned forward, peering into the void. And that's when it happened. A vision flashed before her eyes, a flood of images, unfamiliar yet vivid. She saw a child sitting on the floor of a dimly lit room surrounded by books. The child's eyes were wide, filled with terror, and in their hands, they clutched a book bound in leather. The room around them was shifting, warping, as if reality itself was bending. Olivia stumbled back, gasping for air, her heart hammering in her chest. "What the hell?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The air around her felt charged, as though the very tree was alive, feeding on her fear. She quickly turned to run back to the campsite, but when she looked over her shoulder, she saw something that froze her in her tracks. The tree's hollow wasn't empty anymore. There, just inside the dark space, something moved, a shadow, a shape that was too large to be a trick of the light. Olivia stumbled backward, almost falling to the ground. The others were already waking up at the sound of her footsteps, and one by one, they emerged from their tents, all looking disoriented and afraid. "What happened?" Jake asked, his voice filled with concern. I saw something in there," Olivia stammered, pointing toward the hollow. "I don't know what it was, but it wasn't right." "What do you mean, wasn't right?" Mark asked, his voice tense. Before Olivia could respond, they all heard it. The same scratching, the same tapping. This time, it was louder, more insistent. It seemed to echo in the forest, a sound that came from everywhere and nowhere all at once. "I don't like this," Emily whispered, her voice shaking. "We need to leave," but something about the tree still called to them. They couldn't tear themselves away from its pull. Each of them felt it, a compulsion to get closer, to look inside. And one by one they gave in. Mark was the first to step forward, reaching out toward the tree, his hand trembling. As he touched the bark, his eyes went wide, and a sound, almost like a low growl, rumbled from within the hollow. "Mark!" Jake asked, but Mark didn't answer. His gaze was fixed on the darkness within the tree. The vision that Olivia had experienced rushed over him, pulling him in like a torrent. He saw flashes of a figure, standing in the shadows, its eyes glowing red. The figure stretched out a hand toward him, and Mark reached for it. "No!" Sarah screamed, rushing forward to pull him back. But it was too late. Mark's body jerked violently, as though he were being pulled into the tree. The others rushed to help, but they couldn't break his grip on the tree. It was as though something ancient and powerful, was holding him there. The tree groaned, a sound that came from deep within the earth, and the hollow seemed to expand, pulling the air into its depths. The vision overtook them all. Each of them saw a different life, a different reality, but they all shared one thing in common: the entity inside the tree. It was old, so old that it predated the forest itself, and it was hungry. With a final scream, Mark was yanked into the hollow, his body disappearing into the darkness. The others fell to their knees, terrified and trembling. They had seen it, the thing that had been trapped inside the tree, waiting for centuries. And now it had Mark. "We need to leave," Emily whispered. "Now." But when they tried to flee, the trees closed in around them, their roots twisting and shifting like serpents, cutting off their escape. The forest had become alive, and it was hunting them. As they struggled to break free, the hollow tree stood silent, its dark interior waiting for the next soul to approach. And the wind whispered through the branches, carrying the promise of more. Story 6. The Burning Eyes of the Ridge. The day the Bennett family arrived at the base of Burning Ridge, the air was crisp and the sky clear. They'd heard the rumors, the ones that painted the mountain with dark tales of glowing lights and strange occurrences. But they were here to forget those stories. They'd planned this camping trip for months, hoping the quiet, remote beauty of the forest would allow them to bond and escape the stresses of daily life. Burning Ridge, though, had a reputation. Its name alone seemed to hold some kind of ominous weight. The ridge was known for strange lights that would flicker and float just above the tree line at night, especially on clear nights like this one. Some said they were the eyes of something ancient, something that roamed the mountain after dark. Others claimed it was just a natural phenomenon, the result of gas rising from the rocks. No one really knew. The Bennetts, David, his wife Claire, and their 2 children, Sam and Lucy, set up camp near a small clearing at the foot of the ridge, blissfully unaware that they were about to become part of the very legend they dismissed so easily. They spent the day hiking and gathering firewood, settling down for dinner just as the sun began to dip below the horizon. The warmth of the fire crackled around them as the forest seemed to settle into an uneasy silence. As night fully descended, a chill crept through the air, and the sound of wind rustling the trees became their only companion. The lights started small, pinpricks of red and orange that flickered in the distance, far up the slope of the mountain. Claire, ever the skeptic, chuckled, shaking her head. Probably just some campers with lanterns. Or maybe a wildfire from last season, she suggested, trying to dismiss the unease that crept into her voice. But David's curiosity was piqued. He stood up, squinting into the darkness. Those lights, they're different. Almost like eyes, don't you think? Eyes? Claire raised an eyebrow, clearly trying to remain lighthearted. You've been watching too many horror movies, David. Sam, the older of the 2 children at 12, leaned forward. They'd look kind of weird, like they're moving. Lucy, who was 8, had already buried her face in her mother's jacket, not interested in the conversation. But even she had seen the lights out of the corner of her eye. David couldn't shake the feeling that there was something about those lights that didn't sit right with him. He stood up, brushing off his jeans, and said, "I'll go take a look, just to see what it is. Don't worry, I'll be right back." Claire gave him a hesitant glance, but nodded. "All right, but don't go too far. You don't know what's up there." David smiled, as if to reassure her, though the truth was, he was already feeling the pull of something beyond the lights. Something that stirred something deep inside of him, something he couldn't explain. He grabbed a flashlight, and with a final glance at his family, began walking toward the lights. The ground beneath him was soft with fallen leaves, and the night air had a biting chill that made him shiver despite the warmth of the fire behind him. As he walked deeper into the forest, the lights grew brighter, more distinct and closer. The further David went, the more intense the lights became. They pulsed in the distance, flickering like they were beckoning him. His heart began to race, and he found himself moving faster, his feet carrying him without thought, as though something invisible was pulling him forward. "David!" Claire's voice called out from behind him. "David, stop! Come back!" But David couldn't stop. The lights were too mesmerizing, too compelling. He stumbled forward, his mind a haze of confusion and growing fear. The path he'd been following seemed to twist and bend with each step, as though the forest itself was shifting underfoot. The trees grew denser, and the light grew so bright, so blinding, that David had to shield his eyes. It was as though he was walking into the very heart of the mountain. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the lights stopped. David's breath came in sharp gasps, and he found himself standing in a small clearing. The woods around him had fallen deathly silent. No wind, no birds, no rustling of animals. He was alone, utterly alone, and yet the air felt thick, suffocating. And then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw it. At first, it was a faint outline, a shadow in the darkness, but it quickly grew sharper, more defined. It was a shape, a massive creature, towering above him, with eyes that burned like fire. Two blazing orbs that pierced through the blackness of the night, staring at him with an intensity that made his blood run cold. David froze. The creature's shape was monstrous, its form shifting as if made of smoke and shadows. But its eyes, those burning eyes, were unmistakable. They followed him, moving with him as he stepped back, paralyzed with terror. His heart pounded in his chest, the blood rushing in his ears as he turned and fled, not caring where he was going, only that he needed to get away from those eyes, from that thing that was hunting him. But the forest had changed. The path he had been following was gone, swallowed by the darkness. The trees loomed around him like silent sentinels, and every step felt like it was pulling him further into the mountain, deeper into its heart. David stumbled, his breath ragged, as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing, what he was hearing. The sounds of the forest were distant, muffled, and all he could focus on were the glowing eyes that seemed to be drawing closer, inch by terrifying inch. And then, in the blink of an eye, he was gone. Claire and the children waited by the fire, their conversation turning to concern as the minutes stretched into hours. David hadn't returned. She called out for him, but there was no answer. Sam and Lucy were beginning to grow anxious, their voices small with fear. "It's been too long," Claire whispered, wrapping her arms around the children. "He should have come back by now." Just as she was about to grab the flashlight and search for him, she heard a faint rustling in the distance, an eerie noise, like something moving through the woods. She called out for David again, her voice trembling, but there was still no reply. The night was swallowing the forest, and the flickering lights were still visible in the distance, pulsing like a heartbeat. After what felt like an eternity, Claire, Sam, and Lucy ventured into the woods, hoping to find David. They followed the lights, moving cautiously, their footsteps soft against the earth. And then they saw it, the clearing, the unnatural stillness of the air, the blackened, twisted shape in the center of the forest. But David was gone. Only his footprints, leading deeper into the trees, remained. Claire called his name, but the only answer was the soft whisper of the wind, just like David had heard earlier. But then in the distance, she saw them, two burning eyes glaring at her from the shadows. And she knew, with a sickening certainty, that it was the same creature that had taken him. The family tried to run, but the forest had already closed in on them. The lights, those burning, blinding lights, followed them, and they were never seen again. The only thing that remained was the whisper of the wind through the trees and the glow of the eyes, waiting for the next foolish family to set up camp near Burning Ridge. Story 7. The Whispers of the Wild. It was supposed to be a simple trip, a weekend getaway, just a group of 5 friends in the woods. The air was still, the trees thick with the smell of pine, and the sky overhead painted in late afternoon hues. They had all come to escape from the noise of their lives, the grind of work, the endless hum of technology that always seemed to invade their peace. But as they made their way deeper into the woods, something felt off. The further they went, the quieter it became. Josh, the leader of the group, a guy who prided himself on knowing the lay of the land, said they were in good territory. There was no reason to be worried. But even his assurances couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The woods felt too still, too unnatural. The trees stood like sentinels, their thick trunks looming in the fading light. "It's just the forest, man. Stop being paranoid," Mark said, clapping Josh on the back as they set up camp near a small clearing by a stream. But Josh couldn't shake the feeling. It was like the woods were holding their breath. There was an eerie silence, almost like the trees were watching them, waiting. They built a fire and sat around it, cracking jokes and opening beers. The evening air was cool, and the smell of the smoke mingled with the earthy scent of the forest. But even as they laughed, there was something in the back of Josh's mind that wouldn't let go. Every now and then, he would glance at the darkening woods, and every time, it felt like something was watching him. "I'm telling you, this place feels wrong," he said again, his voice quieter now. "That's just your imagination," Leah, his girlfriend, said, nudging him with her elbow. "It's a camping trip. Relax." Josh nodded, though he didn't feel relaxed. His eyes lingered on the trees, their shadows stretching longer as the firelight flickered and danced. Something wasn't right, and deep down he knew it wasn't just in his head. The first whisper came just as the stars began to appear in the sky, small pinpricks of light in the vastness of the night. It was faint at first, like the rustling of wind through the trees, but it wasn't the wind. It was a voice, low and indecipherable. Josh froze, his heart skipping a beat. "Did you hear that?" he asked. Leah, sitting beside him, looked at him quizzically. "Hear what?" "I swear, I heard something, a voice." "Probably just an animal," Mark chimed in, his eyes half closed as he leaned back in his chair. "Relax, Josh. You've been on edge all day." Josh shook his head, standing up and walking toward the edge of the campfire's light. The whispers had grown louder, like a chorus of voices, but still just outside the range of understanding. The trees were too dense to see anything, but Josh could feel something was there. He strained his ears, trying to catch the words. They were just out of reach. And then he heard it clearer this time, his name. Josh. The voice was soft, almost a whisper, but it was his name, unmistakable. His breath caught in his throat. "Did you hear that?" he asked, turning back to the group. Leah and Mark exchanged glances, both of them looking confused. "No," Leah said. "You're hearing things." But Josh wasn't so sure. The voice had been real, and it had come from the woods. He stood frozen, trying to process what had just happened, when suddenly another whisper came, this time calling Mark's name. Mark stood up abruptly, his eyes wide. "Did you hear that?" he asked, voice rising in surprise. "What?" Leah said, looking around nervously. "It said my name," Mark whispered, his voice trembling slightly. Josh felt his stomach tighten. This wasn't right. He turned around again, staring into the woods, his eyes straining to see beyond the darkness. There was nothing there, just the trees and the shadows that they cast. But the whispers, those whispers, they weren't just in his head. "Let's get out of here," Josh said, his voice rising with panic. "We need to leave." "Calm down, Josh," Leah said, her tone trying to be soothing. "It's just the wind or something. Nothing to worry about." But as she said it, the whispers came again. Only this time, they were more urgent. They were coming from every direction, overlapping like 1,000 voices. The hairs on the back of Josh's neck stood up, his breath quickening. And then, just as suddenly, they stopped. The silence was worse than the whispers. It was suffocating. Josh's heart pounded in his chest. "Something's not right," he said again, his voice shaking. "I don't care what you say. I'm not staying here." Mark stood up, rubbing the back of his neck. All right. We'll pack up and head back in the morning." But as the group began to gather their things, something strange happened. Leah, who had been standing near the fire, suddenly stopped, her eyes wide. She stared into the woods, and Josh saw her expression change from confusion to something darker. "Leah?" Josh asked, his voice trembling. She didn't respond. She was staring at something just beyond the tree line. Josh's stomach churned as he followed her gaze, but all he could see were the trees, the shadows. Then she whispered, "Do you hear it?" The voice, the whisper, but it wasn't coming from the trees anymore. It was coming from Leah. Josh stepped back, panic surging through him. He grabbed her by the shoulder, shaking her gently. "Leah, snap out of it." Her eyes flicked to him, but they weren't the same. They were distant, lost, and then she started walking toward the trees. "Leah, no," Josh shouted, rushing after her. But she didn't stop. She didn't even acknowledge him. She walked deeper into the woods, her footsteps slow and deliberate. "Leah, stop!" Josh yelled again, but his voice faltered. Mark grabbed his arm, pulling him back. "Don't follow her. We can't go after her." But Josh wasn't listening. He broke free from Mark's grip and ran into the woods after her. The trees seemed to close in around him as he pushed forward, his heart racing. The deeper he went, the darker it became. The whispers, too, grew louder. They seemed to come from all directions now, the words too jumbled to understand. But one thing was clear: they were calling to him, to all of them. He broke through the underbrush and saw Leah standing in a small clearing. She was facing away from him, her back to a large, gnarled tree. Her arms were outstretched, and her mouth was moving, but no sound came out. "Leah!" Josh shouted, running toward her. She turned slowly, her face pale, her eyes wide with terror. She opened her mouth to speak, but all that came out was a strangled, silent scream. Suddenly, the ground beneath them seemed to shift. The tree in front of Leah groaned, its bark twisting and contorting, and from within the trunk, something black and writhing began to emerge. It was like a shadow, but not a shadow. It had mass. It had weight. It was alive. Josh froze, his blood running cold. The whispers grew louder, now distinct, words he could understand. "You are ours." The thing that emerged from the tree was not human. It was something older, something that had been waiting, hidden in the depths of the woods, feeding on the souls of those who ventured too close. Josh turned and ran. He could hear Leah's scream, but he didn't dare look back. The voices followed him, growing louder, more insistent. They were calling for him, and he knew they would never stop. By the time Mark and the others found him, the forest was silent again. The trees were still, as if nothing had happened. But Josh knew better. They had been marked, and they would never escape the whispers of the wild. Story 8. The Blood Moon at Camp Blackwell. The dusty trail to Camp Blackwell twisted through the dense pine forest like a snake, narrow and shadowed even in the brightest sunlight. The camp itself sat in a hollow, surrounded by towering trees that seemed to close in on it like silent sentinels. To the 6 campers arriving that summer, it looked like an escape from the world, a place where they could disconnect and just be. What they didn't know was that they were walking straight into a nightmare. Anna, the unofficial leader of the group, parked the van with a grin. "All right, folks, welcome to Camp Blackwell, home of ghost stories, bad decisions, and one hell of a view." Beside her, Jake stretched his long legs. "I called dibs on the biggest tent," he said with a smirk, earning a playful shove from Mia, his girlfriend. The others, Ethan, Lauren, and Ryan, spilled out of the van, already arguing about who would handle what tasks. They unloaded gear and set up camp in the clearing near the dilapidated cabins. The cabins were off limits, their doors nailed shut, but that only added to their charm. You know this place is cursed, right? Lauren said as she rolled out her sleeping bag. Cursed? Ryan asked, raising an eyebrow. Yeah. Blood moon rises. People vanish. Yada yada. Classic campfire stuff. Ethan chuckled nervously. I read about it online. Apparently, back in the 1800s, this area was home to some weird cult. They worshipped the moon, thought it had the power to bring people back from the dead. And how'd that work out for them? Jake asked, lighting a cigarette. Lauren shrugged. They all died mysteriously. No bodies were ever found. Just bloodstains and bones, I guess. Great, Mia muttered. Now I'm not sleeping tonight. The group laughed it off, as people do when they're too young to believe in real danger. The evening passed in a haze of laughter, grilled food, and the occasional spooky story. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, an unnatural chill settled over the camp. The wind, once gentle, grew sharp, rustling the trees in odd, unsettling patterns. Then the moon rose. It wasn't like any moon they'd seen before. It was huge, looming in the sky like an omen. Its crimson light bathed the forest, painting the world in shades of red and black. Whoa, Ethan said, staring upward. That's kind of creepy. Just a blood moon, Anna said, though her voice wavered. It's rare, but it's normal. But it didn't feel normal. Not when the first sound broke through the stillness. A low, guttural wail echoed through the forest, starting soft and then rising to a deafening crescendo. It wasn't human. It was an animal. It was something in between. What the hell was that? Mia whispered, clutching Jake's arm. No idea, Jake said, his bravado suddenly gone. Then they noticed Ethan was missing. The search began immediately. Anna organized them into pairs, and they ventured into the surrounding woods with flashlights and knives. Stay close, she warned, and don't split up. Lauren and Ryan took the north trail, where the trees grew so close together that their flashlights barely penetrated the darkness. Mia and Jake headed toward the cabins, their beams sweeping over rotted wood and broken windows. Anna stayed behind at the camp, shouting Ethan's name into the night. But the forest didn't return her calls. Instead, it seemed to mock her, amplifying her voice and twisting it into something alien. Meanwhile, Lauren and Ryan found something on the trail, a smear of blood leading deeper into the woods. Maybe he got hurt, Lauren whispered. Ryan frowned. That's not normal. There's too much of it. They followed the trail, their nerves fraying with every step. The blood led to a tree, massive and gnarled, its bark slick with a dark, sticky substance. Carved into the trunk was a symbol neither of them recognized, a circle with jagged lines radiating outward like a twisted sun. Let's go back, Lauren said, pulling on Ryan's arm. But Ryan didn't move. His eyes were fixed on the tree, wide with terror. Do you hear that? Hear what? The whispers. At the cabins, Mia and Jake found a similar trail of blood leading to one of the nailed shut doors. The nails had been pulled out, lying in the dirt like discarded bones. Do we go in? Mia asked, her voice trembling. Jake hesitated, then nodded. Stay behind me. They stepped inside. The air was thick, heavy with the stench of decay. Their flashlight beams danced over walls covered in more of those strange symbols, drawn in what looked like blood. In the corner of the room was a pile of old, tattered clothes, clothes that looked eerily familiar. "Jake," Mia whispered. "Those are Ethan's." Before he could respond, the cabin door slammed shut. The walls began to vibrate, a deep, resonant hum that seemed to come from the earth itself. And then the screaming started. Back at the camp, Anna saw the first figure emerge from the woods. It looked like Ethan, but something was wrong. His movements were jerky, unnatural, like a puppet on strings. His eyes glowed with a dull red light, and his mouth hung open in a silent scream. "Ethan," Anna called out, backing away. He lunged at her. Anna grabbed a stick from the fire pit and swung, the burning wood connecting with his chest. He staggered back, but he didn't fall. Instead, he grinned, a horrible, too wide grin that split his face nearly in two. "Join us," he rasped, his voice layered with something ancient and inhuman. Anna screamed and ran. By the time the group reconvened, they were no longer a group. Ryan was missing. Lauren was covered in scratches and barely coherent. Mia and Jake had claw marks on their arms from something they couldn't describe. And the forest was alive. The trees moved, their branches twisting like arms. The ground beneath their feet pulsed, as though the earth itself was breathing. And the moon watched it all, red and malevolent, casting everything in its hellish glow. "We have to leave," Anna said, her voice shaking. "Now," but there was no way out. The forest had closed around them, and the whispers were growing louder. One by one, the blood moon claimed them, until the forest was silent again. When the rangers arrived weeks later, all they found were the abandoned cabins and a circle of ash where the campfire had once been. No bodies, no blood, just the faint smell of smoke and the lingering feeling that the forest was watching. Always watching. Story 9. The Shape in the Shadows. David had always preferred the wilderness to the suffocating chaos of city life. He liked the quiet, the way the trees seemed to stretch endlessly upward, the way the wind whispered through the leaves, the way time seemed to slow down when you were surrounded by nature. He'd been camping solo for years, priding himself on being able to navigate the most remote parts of the forest. He never felt unsafe until this trip. It started on the third day of his week-long adventure deep in the heart of the Rockies. He had pitched his tent near a small, crystal-clear stream, far away from any marked trails or campsites. The first 2 days had been uneventful, peaceful even, but by the third evening, David began to feel off. It was nothing he could pinpoint, just a faint unease, like the weight of the forest had shifted. The feeling became more tangible as he was packing up his gear to hike further into the woods. He felt eyes on him. Turning sharply, he scanned the surrounding trees. Nothing, just the dense greenery and the late afternoon sunlight filtering through the branches. He shook his head and muttered to himself, "Get it together, man." He set off, following the stream deeper into the forest. But as he walked, he started to notice something odd. A shadow seemed to be trailing him. At first, he thought it was just his own, a trick of the low-hanging sun casting his silhouette on the uneven ground. But as the light faded, the shadow remained. It wasn't tied to him or the trees. It was just there, keeping its distance but always present. David stopped abruptly and spun around, his heart thudding in his chest. Nothing, just the stillness of the forest, the occasional chirp of a bird, and the rustling of leaves in the breeze. He told himself it was his imagination, the result of too much time alone. But when he turned back to his path, he thought he saw movement just at the edge of his vision. The shadow was there again. That night, David set up camp earlier than usual. The feeling of being watched had intensified, and he didn't want to be wandering in the dark. He built a fire and sat close to it, hoping its warmth and light would chase away whatever irrational fears were creeping into his mind. As the fire crackled, he tried to focus on his dinner, but his appetite was gone. His eyes kept drifting to the darkness beyond the firelight. The forest seemed too quiet now, as if every living thing had decided to retreat, leaving David alone with the stillness and the shadow. He didn't sleep well. Every time he drifted off, he woke up with a start, convinced he'd heard something, a faint rustle, a low whisper, or the crunch of leaves. But when he looked out of his tent, there was nothing there. Morning brought little comfort. David was exhausted but determined to push on. He told himself that he was being ridiculous. Shadows didn't follow people. Still, he couldn't shake the unease. As he packed up, he noticed something that made his stomach drop. The ground around his tent was disturbed. Footprints, but they weren't his. They were long, narrow, and impossibly deep, as if something heavy had been pacing around his camp all night. By the fifth day, the shadow wasn't just something he saw out of the corner of his eye. It was real. It moved when he moved, pausing when he paused, and it was getting closer. David tried to outpace it, hiking faster and faster, even jogging at times. But no matter how far or fast he went, it stayed with him. Once, he turned around so quickly that he caught a clearer glimpse of it, a shape darker than the shadows of the trees, with an outline that didn't make sense. It was tall and thin, with long, spindly limbs that seemed to twist unnaturally. "Leave me alone," he shouted into the forest, his voice echoing off the trees. But there was no response, only the stillness of the woods and the faint rustling that always seemed to follow him. That night, David decided he couldn't stay out here any longer. He had planned to camp for another 2 nights, but he knew he wouldn't last. Whatever was following him wasn't going to stop, and he was miles away from civilization. His only hope was to get up at first light and head back the way he came, but the shadow had other plans. David woke in the middle of the night, his heart pounding. The air in his tent was freezing, far colder than it should have been. He could feel it, the presence, the weight of something watching him. Slowly, he turned his head toward the thin nylon wall of the tent. There it was. The shadow stood just outside, its form barely visible through the fabric. It didn't move, but David could feel its gaze, heavy and malevolent. He held his breath, hoping it would go away, but it didn't. Instead, the shadow began to press against the tent, its shape warping the material as it leaned closer. David scrambled out of his sleeping bag, grabbing the hunting knife he kept by his side. "Get away from me," he shouted, his voice trembling. But the shadow didn't retreat. The tent quivered as if a great wind was blowing against it. But outside, the forest was silent. Desperate, David unzipped the tent and lunged out, slashing at the air with his knife. The shadow recoiled, its form flickering like smoke caught in a gust. But it didn't disappear. It hovered just beyond the firelight, its shape more distinct now. It wasn't human. Its limbs were too long, its body too thin, and its face, or what passed for a face, was an empty void. David didn't wait to see what it would do next. He grabbed his backpack and ran. The forest blurred around him as he sprinted through the darkness, the sound of his own ragged breathing drowning out everything else. But the shadow followed, gliding effortlessly through the trees. He didn't stop until the first light of dawn broke through the canopy. Exhausted and terrified, he collapsed against a tree, his body trembling. The shadow was gone, or so it seemed. The forest looked normal again, alive with the sounds of birds and insects. But David knew better. He made it back to civilization later that day, but he never felt truly safe again, even in his apartment, surrounded by concrete and glass. He sometimes caught glimpses of it, a flicker of darkness in the corner of his eye, a shadow that didn't belong. The shape in the shadows had found him, and it wasn't letting go. Story 10. The Cursed Waters of Wraith Lake. The forest around Wraith Lake had an ancient, brooding quality. The trees, their trunks gnarled and twisted, stood like silent sentinels guarding a secret that no one dared to speak aloud. The lake itself was hidden deep within the wilderness, untouched by time, and avoided by all but the foolish or the desperate. Local legends spoke of its cursed waters and the people who had ventured too close, never to return. For generations, whispers of Wraith Lake had fueled campfire stories, but no one could ever confirm the truth. But for Jared, Amanda, Mike, and Chloe, the legends were an invitation. "It's just a lake," Jared said as they parked the SUV at the trailhead. He was the group's de facto leader, the one with the maps and the stubborn confidence that they'd all make it back in one piece. People make up stories to keep the good spots to themselves. Amanda wasn't so sure. She glanced up at the canopy of trees. The sunlight filtered through, casting long shadows on the ground, and a strange hush seemed to hang in the air. "Feels weird here," she muttered, but no one paid attention. The hike was long, the trail winding through dense undergrowth and rocky terrain. As they ventured deeper, the forest seemed to close in around them. The air grew heavier, and the bird song that had accompanied them at the start of the journey faded into an oppressive silence. Mike, carrying most of the gear, wiped sweat from his brow. "Why do we always let Jared pick the camping spots?" He joked, but his voice was uneasy. "Because I'm the only one with guts," Jared shot back. When they finally reached the lake, the sight stopped them in their tracks. Wraith Lake wasn't like any of the serene mountain lakes they'd visited before. The water was black, not in the way of shadowed depths, but as if it absorbed light itself. The surface was perfectly still, like glass, yet it offered no reflection of the towering trees or the pale blue sky. "Okay, that's unsettling," Chloe admitted, setting her pack down. Jared dismissed her. "It's just a mineral thing, perfectly natural. The group set up camp on a flat patch of ground a few yards from the shore. Amanda couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, but whenever she glanced over her shoulder, there was nothing but trees and shadows. That night, they lit a fire and tried to laugh off the eerie atmosphere. Jared told the story of the lake's curse, embellishing the details for dramatic effect. They say the lake doesn't just take people, he said, leaning into the firelight. It keeps them, like their spirits or whatever are trapped down there, waiting to pull someone else under. Cool story, Mike said, rolling his eyes. Now who's got marshmallows? But Amanda wasn't laughing. She stared out at the lake, its dark surface just barely visible beyond the firelight. She thought she saw something ripple, but when she looked again, it was as still as death. The next morning, they decided to test Jared's theory that the lake was just an ordinary body of water. He and Mike hauled out the fishing rods while Chloe and Amanda explored the shoreline. "Come on, Amanda," Jared called as he cast his line into the black water. "You scared of catching a ghost fish?" Amanda shook her head, but didn't join them. Something about the lake unnerved her more with each passing minute. She wandered a little farther along the shore, her eyes catching on strange patterns in the mud, lines and swirls that didn't look natural, almost like runes. "Hey guys, check this out," she called, but when she turned around, she froze. The surface of the lake was rippling now, though there was no wind, and the ripples weren't random. They moved with purpose, converging on the spot where Jared and Mike's lines dangled in the water. "Guys," she shouted, but it was too late. The water erupted. Something massive and shadowy broke the surface, a shape that defied logic or description. It wasn't a fish or an animal. It was darkness itself, rising from the depths. Jared and Mike screamed as their fishing lines snapped, and the shadow surged toward the shore. The four of them ran. Back at the campsite, they grabbed what little they could and bolted for the trail. But the forest seemed different now, the paths twisting in ways they hadn't before. The trees loomed closer, their branches reaching like skeletal fingers. And the lake wasn't far behind. No matter how fast they ran, the sound of water sloshing and crashing grew louder. The shadow moved with them, spilling over the ground in unnatural waves. Amanda tripped, her foot catching on a root. She looked up to see the others running ahead, oblivious to her fall. But when she turned back, the shadow was there. It wasn't just darkness. It was faces, hundreds of them, twisted in silent screams, their eyes hollow and their mouths wide. They stared at her, pleading, accusing, and Amanda felt a pull, like the lake was reaching for her soul. "Get up!" Chloe's voice broke through, and Amanda scrambled to her feet. They ran until their lungs burned, until the forest thinned and the trailhead came into view. When they finally reached the safety of the car, they collapsed, shaking and gasping for air. "Did you see it?" Jared whispered. No one answered. They drove back to town in silence, but the nightmare didn't end. That night, Amanda dreamed of the lake. She saw the faces again, their screams louder this time. And when she woke up, she found her pillow damp, not with sweat, but with black water. The group never spoke of Wraith Lake again, but they all knew the truth. The lake was alive, and it had marked them. And someday, it would call them back.